Hello, just testing if everybody can hear me. Uh, Alex, do you want to bring up the PowerPoint? Okay, it's at 11:29 on my clock, so we'll kick off at 11:30. Um, so we'll just give others an extra minute to attend. Alex will be running the PowerPoint, which is on the screen now. So it's 11:30. So I'll make a start. And in doing so, I just want to acknowledge all of the lands, traditional lands of Indigenous people that we're on today. Um, I'm on Larrakia country, so I just want to acknowledge that and acknowledge the lands that everybody else is attending this webinar from. I also want to acknowledge all of the non-Indigenous people who do amazing work working with Indigenous people and encourage them to continue to do that amazing work and thank them on behalf of Indigenous people. So today's session is going to be about qualitative research and Indigenous people. I'm going to provide information about qualitative research and doing that type of research on Indigenous people and offer some practical advice for Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people who are doing qualitative research with Indigenous people. Due to time constraints, there are things that I've had to leave out, and there are things that I'm not going to be able to delve into as deep as I would like to. So perhaps these can be a topic for another webinar in the future. But still, there is lots to cover, so I'm just going to move along and move to the next slide. So qualitative research, I'm sure that we've all heard the term before, qualitative research. Despite hearing it, many of us may not really understand what it is. It's very simple. Qualitative research is an approach to research that seeks to gain a deeper understanding of people's thoughts, feelings, opinions, and emotions. And it is not concerned with numbers or statistics. So, qualitative research approaches allow us to go deeper into social issues and allows us to gather data that may not surface through quantitative research approaches. For example, we might know that 50% of a employer's workforce leave that employer in the first 12 months. However, we may not understand why, and we may not understand how we can prevent that from happening without talking to people and getting their feelings and opinions. And that's where qualitative research can help us. It can help us develop strategies and help us understand those issues better. And it can also help us to understand those issues as they relate to specific groups within that cohort of employees. So we can combine both to get a really good understanding. As I said, we can do a quantitative study, but then we can dig deeper through talking to people and getting their feelings and thoughts and opinions through a qualitative study. It's my view that if you want to engage Indigenous people in research, the best way to do that is through a qualitative study, qualitative research. So we'll go on to the next slide. And before I go any further, I just wanted to talk about these two questions. What is Indigenous research and who are Indigenous people? Indigenous people are people who have been labelled Indigenous pretty much by government. Prior to colonisation, Indigenous people didn't identify as Indigenous. They identified with their clan groups and their language groups, which they do today, more so than identifying as Indigenous. So anybody can identify as Indigenous if you're born in a particular country, but Indigenous people today identify, as they always have, with their traditional language and clan groups. The other question here is, what is Indigenous research? Well, I don't think there's one definition. Is it research that's on an Indigenous topic that non-Indigenous researchers do? Is it a research team that has Indigenous research assistants? Is it research in Indigenous communities? Is it research that has an Indigenous topic? Or is it research that's been driven by Indigenous people with Indigenous researchers leading that research? So I don't think there is a total definition of what it is. But my definition is that it's a research topic that's been driven by Indigenous people, and the research team doing that research is led by Indigenous researchers. So we'll go on to the next slide. And I just wanted to touch on this. This is about Indigenous attitudes to research. So historically, what's happened is Indigenous people have, I suppose, developed two beliefs about research, which they're fully entitled to develop. One of those is that they do not trust research. So historically, there's been scientific research done on them that has been harmful to them, that they still suffer harm from, because those scientific studies were really concerned with portraying Indigenous people as an inferior race of people and justifying policy approaches to Indigenous people. Basically, it was about saying that these people are inferior, they're a dying race, and this has been proven through the scientific research. The other negative attitude that Indigenous people have to research is that they see so much research going on around them, but they typically see little benefit in it for them, their communities, and their families. This has been the case for a long time, lots of research happening, but little benefit and improvement in the lives of Indigenous people. So lots of people going off doing PhDs, interviewing people in communities, visiting communities, and then never being seen again, never being heard from again. And the Indigenous people who invested in those research projects don't hear anything more about those projects or those researchers. So I suppose that the thing there to alleviate that is for researchers to be very clear about what they're doing, why they're doing it, and what will happen to their research. And I think that's an ethical way of engaging Indigenous people in their research, considering the history of Indigenous research and Indigenous people's, I suppose, beliefs about it. So we'll go to the next slide. So I wanted to talk about culturally appropriate research methodologies. Often people get confused about research methodologies and research methods. So I'm going to talk about both today. Research methodologies are a larger plan. So the research methodology is a bigger plan about how you're going to conduct your research. For example, you might say that, well, I want to find out about the issues and challenges Indigenous men have when they leave drug and alcohol rehab centres. And so as part of your methodology, you might say, well, I've only got a limited budget, so I'm only going to interview people in my local area. I'm going to interview them 6 weeks before they leave the centre, when they leave the centre, and 6 weeks later. So all of that, including your budget, etc., is all part of your methodology. In order to develop a methodology, particularly a culturally appropriate research methodology, you must have a clear understanding of what you want to do with your research before you develop your research methodology. So what I've done there is I've listed some of the common qualitative research methodologies that I believe are culturally appropriate when doing research with Indigenous people. So the top one there, phenomenology. This is the study of lived experience, how people experience certain things. So, for example, you might want to find out how sole parents deal with issues that their children are dealing with at school. Then what you'll be wanting to do, if you wanted to take that approach, is to recruit people who are experiencing that as parents at the time of your study. It's about getting people and getting their lived experiences from them and allowing them to share their reality of that experience with you. Another example is a case study approach. So this is where you will select one case. For example, you might select one organisation and dig deep into that organisation with your question rather than going around trying to skim the surface of 6 or 7 of those. So dealing with one case at a time and digging deeper, allowing for more conversations to happen and more data to surface from them. Another one is narrative inquiry. So this, as the name suggests, is really about giving people the opportunity to share their stories rather than the researcher controlling what questions are. It's about listening to them, allowing them to tell stories about their lives. So that is really, really applicable if you're going to be doing research with Indigenous people. Grounded theory is another common methodology when it comes to qualitative research. Grounded theory, I suppose, is an inductive approach to research where you go out and gather data through, for example, interviews with people, and then as you analyse that data, themes surface, and then your theory emerges from those themes. So it's about getting data, building it up, and then seeing what comes from that data. Another common one, probably not as common today, but definitely was in the past when it comes to Indigenous research, is ethnography. So this is about researchers becoming immersed in a particular environment. It might mean that they go to a particular community. It might mean that they go to a particular school and they spend a lot of time at that school observing, talking to people, making notes, and bringing information from that position that they've immersed themselves in out for other people to understand. So, years ago, people would go and spend 3 years, for example, doing what I suppose would be called a traditional ethnography. People today can still do studies that are ethnographic in nature, where they spend less time immersing themselves in those environments. So there's some approaches that are culturally appropriate methodologies because people are in the environment that are comfortable for Indigenous people and not the other way around. So we'll go to the next slide, and this slide sort of follows on from the previous slide in that this one is going to be about culturally appropriate qualitative research methods as opposed to methodology. So the methods in this regard are data collection techniques. So these are the things that you gather information from people who are your research participants. So culturally appropriate data collection methods when it comes to working with Indigenous people on research topics include storytelling, oral histories, focus groups, semi-structured interviews, yarning, ethnography, and participant observation. So again, allowing people to tell their stories is a good way of empowering them to tell their own story, to highlight what's important to them, and to put things in their own words. Focus groups, it allows Indigenous people to come together and feel safe with other Indigenous people. And what can happen there is what one person says can trigger other conversations and get all sorts of data coming from that, from focus groups. Semi-structured interviews are about, research is not controlling a particular question. They're semi-structured that allow Indigenous people to respond the way that they want to. So these are data collection methods, and these underpin your approach. They complement your research methodology that I mentioned previously. And for those doing a PhD, for example, it would be good for them to grasp the difference between those two terms. What we need to do is it's really important, I suppose, to choose the right methods for the research that you want to do. It is important that the data researchers generate is aligned with the methods that they choose. So this then aligns with the theory that you develop, the recommendations that you make, and the conclusions that you arrive at. So methods are a really important part of that. So if you're going to be talking about something and you say that you're going to go out, you're going to gather this information through this particular way, you really need to make sure that the data that you bring forward and the conclusions that you get from that data align with the way you said you're going to get them. So if you didn't say you were going to have focus groups, and then later on you say, well, in the focus group, study participants often spoke about these issues, then those two things don't align. So we'll go on to the next slide. And this is something that I would encourage all people doing research with Indigenous people to do. It's not difficult to do. I've done it previously, and it's basically incorporating cultural protocols into the research that you're doing. Now, no one person can tell anyone what cultural protocols to use. So these are just some examples that I've put together for the purpose of this webinar, and ones that I've used previously. But you can do whatever you want to do in the context of the research that you are doing. So for example, you might only be doing research on women. So your cultural protocols may be different to research that's only on men. You might be doing cultural protocols, you might be doing research, on traditional owners. So your cultural protocols are going to be different again. So as you can see here, these ones are about restricting participation based on gender. If you think that's important to your study, compensating people for their time and input, ensure that you include traditional owners in your research. That's always a good thing to do. You can imagine how traditional owners would feel if you went to a particular place and interviewed a whole lot of other people, but not them. It's not a great thing to do. Gaining consent face-to-face or using local networks, allowing participants to choose where they are interviewed, where focus groups happen, etc. So focus groups can happen on a beach somewhere. They don't have to be in a office or classroom. situation. They can be anywhere. And I think the best thing to do is to allow study participants to determine where those locations are, give them, a list of where they would like those things to happen, and then go ahead with that. So cultural protocols are important because they show Indigenous people, Indigenous research participants that you as the researcher take those things seriously and that you are in fact embedding it in your research. So it's very important to do that. It's not difficult. If you're doing a thesis, you can have a section in your methodology, probably take 3 or 4 pages, where you talk about your cultural protocols and why they're important to you as the researcher and to your study. So as you can see, they're very simple, but when they all come together, they're important and they can guide you through your study. You can always return to them and make sure that your project is on track and that you're always including them. So we'll go to the next page. So we know what qualitative research is. We know that it's about getting people's feelings, emotions, and thoughts about things. But what are the benefits of it? Well, there are probably too many benefits for me to mention in the time that I've got to deliver this webinar. I've got a list of them there. They allow researchers to ask questions of people. They allow people to work with people. They allow people to get close to people. They allow researchers to incorporate things such as cultural protocols that I've just talked through. They allow researchers to capture the reality of situations and how they impact on people. They allow research participants to express themselves freely and engage with researchers. They're better suited for co-design approaches. So co-design is really about, for example, in this context, Indigenous people and researchers coming together, determining a topic, determining everything about how that topic's going to be researched and what's going to happen. It's very important with co-design that one side of the co-design team doesn't do anything without the other side knowing about it. And that includes determining anything from the get-go. Co-design is about people leaving their egos at the door and allowing people to be equal with them as part of that process. So qualitative research allows for a deeper understanding of human issues. And in doing so, it allows people to see things that they may not see. It allows data to surface that may not have surfaced otherwise. And they're suitable for people to do if they share the cultural background of the people that they're doing research with, even the same gender. So there are things that people are going to talk about if they have something in common with the researcher, such as gender or cultural background. So there's so many things. They're good for sensitive research topics. And one of the important things, particularly when it comes to co-design, is it allows for relationships and trust to develop. Because one of the strengths about co-design is that you develop a relationships for future projects, not just the current one that you're working on. So lots of benefits there. Really, they're about people being given the opportunity to express themselves, not tick a box, for us to take their expression seriously and for us to understand how they feel and to develop approaches that otherwise would not have been developed. So we'll go to the next slide. I'm going through this a little bit quickly due to time constraints. I understand that people are having lunch, etc. So this slide is things to consider when doing qualitative research in an Indigenous context. It's really important to understand that, Indigenous people are Indigenous people wherever they are and whatever their background is and whatever they're doing at the time of the study. And what I mean by that is that people can go off trying to find what they believe to be the most authentic Indigenous voice they can get. And there is no such thing, because an Indigenous perspective is an Indigenous perspective. And what you want to get is all of those perspectives, because that increases the richness of data and increases our understanding of issues. And that's going to be determined by the topic, of course. If you want to talk to people about, employment issues, then you should probably talk to people who have been in employment, etc. So that's something to consider. The other thing to consider is that you might be doing a PhD, you might have got this funding to do this research that kicks off your research career, etc. And you're excited about it. I'm going to do my PhD and looking forward to it. But that doesn't mean that the Indigenous people that you're going to go and interview, or you want to interview, feel the same way about your research. So that's just something to consider. One of the other things you might want to consider is when you do your literature review, which is an examination of the literature that you're on the topic that you're working on, are there any Indigenous writers in your literature review? And if they are, have you had a look at what they've got to say? Another thing to consider is when you're out there interviewing people, do Indigenous people agree with the main themes in the literature? That's really important to gain that understanding and to bring about new knowledge if that question has been neglected previously. Are you including Indigenous people in your research? And are you allowing for gender representation? And as I said previously, representation of traditional owners. My own view is that if anybody's going to do Indigenous research, they should invite traditional owners to feed into that research, allow them to have their say. So they're just some things to consider. And there's some things that you can really get stuck into in terms of writing a research paper, developing a thesis with those sort of things in them. What does the literature say? And then you can have a section on, well, what do Indigenous people think about what the literature says? Those sort of things. So we'll go to the next slide. Gathering data. Well, that's what qualitative researchers do. They go out and they gather data from people, not from computers and not from graphs. They actually talk to people. So these are some tips when you're gathering data. If you are about to conduct research, qualitative research, start recording notes immediately before things become normal in your thinking. Record notes immediately so you don't take them for granted later. Avoid too many research participants or focus group members. Often people will say, well, I need to get 100 people to do this research. No, you don't need to do that. Sometimes you only need 5 or 6 people. Sometimes you only need 3 or 4, depending on the nature of it. It's a lot easier to have ongoing conversations with smaller numbers. It's a lot easier to write up what they're saying, to analyse what they're saying. And what you're looking for is something called saturation. So if you have 10 people that you interview or 10 focus group members, having 20 going to add more points to it, going to add more, how can I say, more themes? Probably not. It just means you have to do more work in terms of gathering those people and managing the data that they give you. So what you're wanting is saturation, not numbers. Saturation is about, okay, I've explored this, got all of these issues that have emerged from it, there's plenty there. And sometimes adding more people doesn't add to that saturation at all. Smaller groups allow you to have follow-up interviews, to get to know people and to share the data that you've come up with, which is also really important. Another key issue with gathering data in qualitative studies is to record all literature that you use from the beginning. Often people will come back trying to find literature for their reference list and they can't find it, so they can't use that data because it's got to be referenced. So make sure you record all of the literature that you are using and referring to, and make sure you don't lose it along the way, because it can be very challenging and time consuming to come back to try to find those references later. Again, the data that you gather must reflect the methods that you chose. If you don't say you're going to talk to people, then you shouldn't be talking about what study participants said later on. You need to ensure that the data you are gathering is relevant to the topic and the research question. So they're just some tips, and they're really important ones, and they can save you a lot of time. We'll go on to the next slide. In the field, because when you're doing qualitative research, whether it's in a remote community or at a school, in town, you're in the field, it's field work. And these are some important practical things to consider. Don't rush people, because you're not going to get the data that you could get from them. They might not want to return. So give people time. Try to make people feel comfortable and relaxed. And a lot of that comes back to how you introduce yourself, your tone of voice, your body language, facial expressions, all those sorts of things. Take notes early, because you won't be able to remember things. And the notes that you take early will have some really powerful and rich stuff in them. You can say that early on in the fieldwork I observed this. You can't say that later. Don't try to do too much in one day. Limit your interviews each day. Often people will say, well, I'm going to go out and interview 20 people today. Don't try to do that, because it will really, you'll get tired. You'll rush people, and you won't make the notes that you could ordinarily make if you're trying to do too much. You want good notes, and you want people to give you good data. You don't want to rush it. So limit your interviews, and allow people to tell their story. Allow them to wander off for a little while, but bring them back gently. That's fine. So all those sorts of things there that you see are really important. Don't be offended or disappointed if you don't get the engagement that you want. Allow research participants to bring people with them. Maintain positive relationships with key people. We can all get pieces of paper from a university, every one of us. But when it comes to doing qualitative research, particularly with Indigenous people, it's more than the piece of paper. It's about how you conduct yourself with those people, particularly in terms of developing relationships and particularly in terms of how deep they will go in terms of sharing information with you. So we'll move on to the next slide. And this is writing up qualitative research. This is where a lot of people have trouble, but they shouldn't. It's actually a really exciting time. So when it comes to writing up qualitative research, these are just some things to consider. Ensure Indigenous voices and perspectives are clear. Okay, so make sure that we bring those voices out. I've seen papers where people are doing research on Indigenous people. I've read them, and I don't really see any Indigenous voices or perspectives in them. Do not try to change terminology. So if somebody says something is gammon, write that they said it is gammon. And all you need to do then to tackle that for the reader is to put footnotes in to explain what gammon means. For example, if somebody says there's lots of business in their community, it doesn't mean they have a thriving economy. It can mean that there are lots of deaths in that community, but they'll use the term business. If people are saying lotta, L-O-T-T-A, put it in there. What you need to do here with qualitative research, in my view, is you're going to have all these quotes from all these people, okay? You can't just put a list of quotes in there. What you need to do is summarize information into themes. So one of those themes could be, for example, that people did not feel comfortable in a particular environment. What you need to do is put all of what people have said into paragraphs and choose one or two of those quotes to capture what people are saying. So, for example, you could say that study participants often spoke about feeling uncomfortable when they were using this service provider. This is captured well by one study participant who explained, and then you could put that as a quote. So use one or two of those quotes to reinforce the other quotes that you're summarizing into paragraph form. And it's really important to include feelings and emotions. So you could say, for example, that when study participants spoke about this particular issue, they often spoke about it in an angry manner. They often used language that indicated they were offended, and they often used facial expressions to reinforce this. Then you could say, this is captured well by one study participant who said, and then you could put in an angry quote that the person had said that captures that. So when people get used to writing up qualitative data, it becomes easier to do. And you'll find out that you've got lots of data there, but you've got one or two quotes that really drive home what people are saying. So don't change the words of study participants, use footnotes, identify one or two summary key themes, and include feelings and emotions as part of your writing up of the data that you gather. And we'll go on to the next slide. And this one is about analysing qualitative data. So the approach that I use and is used often in qualitative research is a thematic analysis. And this is pretty much as I've just explained to you, closely reading the interview transcripts and what study participants have told you, putting that data into themes, then analysing that data to develop new themes. So you might have, the issue here is that it could be, for example, that people feel anxious before they arrive at a service provider. And then you can dig deeper and say, well, these are the issues as to why they feel that way. And then you could have a subsection on anxiety, a subsection on blame, a subsection on perceptions of, whatever. However that data comes out, you break it down, you put it into themes, and you be surprised at how deep you can go with that data. What you have to do, but is keep the themes that you think are important and relevant to your research, because you'll gather so much data that some of it will not be applicable to the aim of the study, and that is okay. Just put that to the side. Sometimes you can use that for conceptual background. You can use that for introductory comments, etc. So don't throw it out. Put that to the side. Again, I've mentioned this previously. You need to ensure that the data that you gather aligns with the research question and reflects your data collection methods. So if you say you're going to have focus groups, talk about what your focus groups have mentioned. If you don't say you're going to talk about focus groups, then you've got no right talking about focus groups later. Having an Indigenous researcher as part of your team can assist you to understand and analyse data. So there might be terms that you've never come across or you think you know, but are not really what the study participants are saying. And having an Indigenous person there can help you understand what they are saying. Again, I've mentioned this, don't change the words of study participants, use footnotes. And as I've said, summarise key themes. You don't need to capture everything, but summarise the key themes. We'll go on to the next topic. So this is sensitive research topics. Sensitive research topics are really important, and qualitative research helps us to understand them. And so if I were to just give you an example of this, for example, if you were to write to an employer A, for example, and say, I would like to do research on racism, discrimination, or bullying in your workplace with your employees, they might not get back to you. They might not be really keen for that research to happen. If you want to find out about those issues, you don't need to include the employer. You can interview the cohort of people that you want and leave their employer out of it. You might want to find out how, for example, Indigenous people perceive discrimination in their workplace, and you can do that at a coffee shop in their lunch hour, or on weekends or after work. It doesn't have to involve the employer, and what that will do is protect the study participant, and it will make them feel more comfortable and confident talking to you about their experiences and their perceptions. So sensitive research topics, don't rush into them. Talk to people who have experienced researchers in those areas. Look at literature to see how people have done them, and always think about the safety of study participants. And what you'll find is there very easy ways to do them that protect study participants. So you can see there that I've got, doesn't matter if you use a recorder. And, people will say, oh, no, it's okay. But depending on the topic, you're going to get a whole lot more if you're not recording what they say. Particularly given the trust that Indigenous people have with research and those sorts of things. So sensitive research topics, don't rush into them. get some advice, and most importantly, gather the information you want that is important for all of us to know while protecting study participants. I will go on to the next slide. So we know what qualitative research is. It's about going out there and talking to people and getting their feelings and emotions and opinions and thoughts and experiences, all of those sorts of things that are really important. But it's challenging, it's time consuming. Talking to people is not as easy as it sounds. People have things come up and they may need to cancel. Focus group might have 1 or 2 people there when you've invited 6. All of those things happened and happen. Pages of text-based data or audio recordings. Here it all is. What do I do with it all? I've just had 3 focus group sessions and I've got 30 pages of stuff. I don't know where to start with it all. Well, there are ways to manage that and best managed with different coloured highlighters as you find those themes. Managing messy field notes. If you're out in the field, you're making notes while you're on the run and talking to people and not taking up their time. So there's, managing that is a challenge. Knowing what to do with so much data and field notes. Understanding that people may not be as committed as you are, and understanding that people may not talk much. They might talk more the second time around. So again, this is where you develop your broader methodology to take into consideration these sorts of challenges. So I was going to talk about subjectivity and reflexivity and Indigenous research. But I think they're probably topics for PhD people, students. So I won't go all the way through them, but I will just say that subjectivity means that there are different ways of seeing the world, and Indigenous people can only see the world and interpret the world as Indigenous people. That's really important, I think, for Indigenous researchers to state up front that as Indigenous researchers doing research with Indigenous people, they are going to have a subjective lens and there's nothing they can do about that. I think that's really important. If we go on to the next one, I think it's sort of about the same thing. This is really about Indigenous people, sort of locating themselves in the study and explaining why they're doing something. So they might have come from a sole parent background and they might want to find out more about that. So they will choose that as their topic. They've just got to write about why they're doing it that way. And what they need to do is let the study participants tell their story rather than telling their own story, if that makes sense. But I'm not going to dig deep into those two for the purpose of time. So we can move on to the next one. Research ethics are really important, but very simple. So the best approach that you can take when it comes to doing research, qualitative research, is just to be clear about how you are going to recruit research participants and why. So when you're filling out your ethics form, don't say, I'm going to be interviewing 6 to 10 people, 6 to 10 Indigenous people about gambling addictions. You need to say how you are going to recruit those people, because that's when people are able to determine if that recruitment is ethical. Be clear about what you'll be asking research participants to do. If you can, offer an Indigenous contact person so that Indigenous study participants can talk to them and ask questions about the research. You need to make sure that your consent form and the plain language statements, are things in plain English that explain the research that you're doing. Okay, you need to make sure that and the consent form are free of long words and academic jargon. People need to confidently understand what you're doing. And if you can, try to limit that to 1 page. Take into consideration gender, if that's part of your research, and explain that to the ethics committee. So you have a group of people sitting around a table. They should have Indigenous people on those committees, these research ethics committees, and their job is to make sure that whatever the researcher is doing, particularly with Indigenous people, is clear to them, so they don't have to ask questions or seek clarity. So what will typically happen is they will ask for clarity, or they will ask for questions, ask you questions. You will then get that back from them, and then you will address what they wanted clarity about or more information about, and you will send it back. And it's sort of like a game of tennis until it's approved. So if you're doing research and your ethics clearance doesn't happen immediately, just continue to work on it with the ethics people, and it will get through eventually. It's all positive for you as a researcher. And of course, the community in which you're doing research. So we'll go to the next slide. These are just some suggested readings. These are good ones, all of them. But my favourite one is the Tuwai Smith one, Decolonising Methodologies. And if you are an Indigenous person who wants to get into research, I strongly suggest you get a copy of that. And I've put a couple of my own in there as well. And they're not too bad either. At all good bookstores. And so, for the purpose of time, I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is, I think, basically seeing if anybody's got any questions, and a website for those who want to learn more about JCTS. So if you've got any questions, feel free to ask them. I think Anthony's got his hand up. Alex?
There is a question in the Q&A from Michelle.
Okay.
The question is, how do we document verbal consent?
How do you document verbal consent?
Yeah.
You would put the date and time that you're obtaining that consent, you're getting that consent. You would document clearly what the consent's about, and you would get the participant to sign it. But what you would do is, if you're doing research, you would give the person a plain language statement that clearly explains the study that you're doing. and a consent form that clearly informs the research participant what is expected of them if they choose to participate in the research. So as long as that's clear to them, all you need to get them to do is sign it. You said verbal, yeah?
Yep, verbal.
Verbal consent, I would say it's better to get it in writing. And if not, you know, get them to sign a piece of paper, but put down what it's all about first. I would always go for a written form, be my view. Or an email. I think I can see another couple of questions there. Alex?
They are comments. So there's a
Okay.
comment from Anthony that says, "Thanks, Curtis, for your very informative presentation." And a thanks
Thank
from
you,
Michelle
Anthony.
for answering her question.
Oh, okay. Well, if there are no more questions, rather than chew up people's time, I just want to thank everybody for attending the webinar. Hope you got something out of it. And thank Alex for her support around everything that she's helped me with in terms of the tech side of things. So thanks, everybody, and I hope you got something out of it. And on that note, I think